Hey, fellow deep divers. You ready to unpack some fascinating stuff about organizational culture? Today, we're diving into a brand new theory that's going to shift how you see the inner workings of companies, maybe even your own.
What's so exciting about this theory is how it takes something often abstract and complex, like organizational culture, and makes it instantly understandable using a powerful metaphor, a river.
Okay, I'm intrigued already, so tell me more about this river metaphor.
Well, imagine organizational culture as a constantly flowing river. It's never still, always moving, with currents that represent the values, behaviors, and beliefs that shape how things truly work within a company.
I love that visual, and I bet everyone listening is already picturing themselves trying to navigate that river.
Exactly. Now, this river has two key currents we need to understand, the visible and the undercurrent.
But let's break those down. What exactly do we mean by visible current?
Think of it as the surface level, things you can easily see, official policies, those shiny mission statements, maybe even those posters about company values hanging in the break room. It's what the company says it's about, its outward image.
Right. But I have a feeling that undercurrent is where things get really interesting. What's lurking beneath the surface?
The undercurrent is the real driving force. The deeper, often unspoken currents that shape the actual dynamics of the organization. Things like power structures, those unwritten rules everyone seems to know but nobody dares to talk about. And even resistance to change. It's how things really work, not just how they're supposed to.
Okay, that makes so much sense. It's the difference between the carefully crafted PR image and the everyday reality of how decisions get made and who truly holds influence.
Precisely. And here's a crucial point this theory highlights. There's no such thing as staying neutral in this river. Even if you're not actively trying to change the culture, you're still being swept along by the current, whether you realize it or not.
That's a powerful insight. So everyone's being influenced by these currents. Where does leadership fit into this river metaphor? Are they just along for the ride too?
Not exactly. Leaders in this model are the ones holding the oars. They have the power to choose a direction, to steer the raft, which represents the organization. Or they can simply drift and let the undercurrent take them wherever it may lead.
Which, if they're not careful, could lead them straight into some rough waters, right?
Absolutely. Letting the undercurrent dictate the direction is a recipe for trouble. It might reinforce negative cultural aspects like biases that prevent certain people from advancing or outdated ways of working that stifle innovation.
So what you're saying is that leadership isn't just about setting a course, it's about actively paddling to overcome those potentially negative forces lurking in the undercurrent. I'm starting to see why this theory is so insightful.
Exactly. And that brings us to another key concept, cultural misalignment. What happens when the visible current, the company's stated values, don't align with the undercurrent? The reality of how things operate.
Well, I can imagine it creates a lot of tension and frustration within the organization. People start to see a disconnect between what leadership says is important and how things actually get done.
You're spot on. Think about it. A company might launch a big diversity and inclusion initiative. But if the undercurrent is still full of implicit bias, that initiative is going to fall flat, right?
Totally. It'll feel performative, like just checking a box. Instead of creating genuine change, employees will see right through it.
Yeah. So, how do leaders avoid this cultural misalignment? What's the antidote?
This is where intentional leadership becomes crucial.
Hmm.
It's not enough to just announce a new set of values or slap a mission statement on the wall. Leaders need to actively assess both the visible and invisible currents and then deliberately paddle against any negative forces that are holding the organization back.
So, it's not just about setting the direction, it's about understanding the forces at play beneath the surface and putting in the effort to navigate them effectively.
Exactly. And the beauty of this theory is that it gives us a practical framework for understanding how to do just that.
I'm already starting to see how this applies to real world situations. Can we dig into some specific examples of how leaders can use this theory to their advantage? Absolutely. Let's explore how this plays out in areas like leadership development, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, even organizational transformations like mergers.
Sounds fascinating. But before we get into that, tell me a bit more about the person behind this theory, Quincy Ruffin. Where did this idea come from?
Well, what's fascinating is that Quincy is a doctoral student at Baylor University, and this theory is part of his ongoing research.
So we're getting a sneak peek into cutting-edge thinking in the field of organizational culture. This is what I love about these deep dives. Okay, let's jump into those real-world examples you mentioned. How can this river metaphor help us understand something as complex as leadership development?
Well, traditionally, leadership development focuses on skills like communication, decision making, things like that. But what Ruffin's theory highlights is the need for something he calls cultural literacy in leaders.
Cultural literacy. I like the sound of that.
Mm.
What does that involve?
Yeah, it means training leaders to be aware of these cultural currents, to be able to assess both the visible and invisible forces shaping their organizations. It's about giving them the tools to read the river, so to speak.
So it's not enough to just have a vision. You have to understand the currents that might help you achieve that vision or potentially sabotage it.
Exactly. And this cultural literacy is especially crucial when we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, which, as you mentioned earlier, can easily become performative if they only address the surface level.
Right, because simply having a diverse workforce doesn't guarantee an inclusive culture. You have to address those deeper undercurrents, the often unconscious biases that might be at play.
Absolutely. Too often, DEI initiatives focus on metrics and representation without tackling the underlying power dynamics and systemic issues that truly create an inclusive environment. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone.
This is giving me so much to think about already.
Yeah.
And I bet our listeners are starting to connect the dots to their own workplace experiences.
I'm sure they are. And that's what's so great about this theory. It's not just an academic exercise. It's a framework that can help us all navigate the complexities of our work lives more effectively.
Okay, this is already mind-blowing, but we've covered a lot of ground. I think we need to pause here and let our listeners digest all this amazing insight. When we come back, let's explore how this theory applies to even more real-world situations and how it compares to other well-known ideas about organizational culture.
You know, one area where this theory really shines is when we look at organizational transformations, especially mergers and acquisitions.
Yes. Trying to merge two companies, each with its own unique culture and history, that's got to be like navigating some serious rapids in our river metaphor.
It absolutely is. And all too often, companies approach these mergers from a purely logistical perspective. They focus on integrating systems and processes, but completely underestimate the cultural clash that's about to happen.
It's like forcing two rivers with completely different currents to suddenly become one.
Yeah.
You're bound to get some serious turbulence.
Exactly. You've got these undercurrents of unspoken norms,
Hmm.
different ways of making decisions, even different levels of risk tolerance. And if you don't address those undercurrents can create massive resistance to the merger.
People might feel like their way of working, their values are being disregarded, which breeds resentment and can really sabotage the whole endeavor.
You're right. Ruffin's theory helps us see that a successful merger isn't just about aligning balance sheets, it's about understanding and intentionally blending those cultural currents.
So instead of trying to force one culture to dominate the other, you're looking for ways to create a new shared culture that honors the best of both.
Exactly. It's about creating a new river, so to speak, with a current that's strong and unified. It requires leaders to be skilled cultural navigators.
This is making me think about another high-stakes area where understanding these currents is crucial: crisis management. When a company faces a scandal or some sort of ethical dilemma, it often seems like those crises expose a deeper cultural problem that was already there.
That's a really astute observation. Think about some of the high-profile corporate scandals we've seen over the years. In many cases, there were warning signs, whispers of unethical behavior, or a culture of silence where people were afraid to speak up.
And those warning signs were essentially ignored because they were part of that hidden undercurrent.
Often that's the case. So when the crisis hits, companies scramble to react. They might fire a few executives or roll out some new policies.
But those actions often feel superficial, like they're only addressing the visible current, the PR problem, without really getting at the root of the issue.
That's right. They're trying to patch the holes in the raft without addressing the current that's causing the leaks.
So how can leaders use this theory to better navigate a crisis? To not just weather the storm, but actually come out stronger?
Well, firstly, they need to be willing to acknowledge the undercurrent and the role it played in creating the crisis. That means asking some tough questions about the company culture. Were there unspoken norms that allowed unethical behavior to flourish? Were certain voices silenced?
It's about taking a deep dive into those cultural waters and really understanding the source of the turbulence.
Precisely. And then it's about taking intentional steps to shift the current in a more positive direction. That might involve revisiting the company's stated values or even overhauling the leadership structure to ensure it supports ethical behavior.
So it's not just about putting out the fire. It's about using the crisis as a catalyst to build a more resilient and ethical culture.
That's exactly right. What's really interesting is that this theory not only offers a new way of looking at organizational culture, it also builds upon and enhances our understanding of some other well-known theories in this field.
That's fascinating. So how does it connect to some of those classic models, like, for example, Edgar Schein's model of organizational culture? That's one we often hear about.
Absolutely. Schein's model is fantastic because it identifies those layers of culture, the artifacts, the espoused values, and the underlying assumptions. Remember those?
Yeah. The artifacts are the visible things, like the dress code or how the office is laid out. Espoused values are what the company says it believes in, and those underlying assumptions are the often unconscious beliefs that drive behavior.
You got it. But what Ruffin's theory adds is the idea of movement, of those currents interacting and influencing each other. It's not enough to just identify the layers. You have to understand how they're constantly shaping the organization's direction.
It's like Schein's model gives us a snapshot, and Ruffin's theory animates that snapshot, showing us how the picture is constantly changing.
That's a great way to put it. And this idea of dynamic movement also distinguishes Ruffin's theory from Hofstede's model of cultural dimensions, which looks at differences between national cultures.
So Hofstede helps us understand cultural norms across different countries, like how some cultures are more hierarchical than others.
Right. But Ruffin is focusing on the internal cultural dynamics within a specific organization. He's saying that even within a single company, there's this constant interplay of currents that shape behavior and outcomes.
It's like zooming in on a specific river, instead of looking at a map of all the rivers in the world. And that brings us to another fascinating connection, social identity theory, which explores how people form in-groups and out-groups.
Right. Exactly. And while social identity theory helps us understand how those group affiliations can lead to bias, Ruffin's theory shows us how those biases become part of that undercurrent, influencing the organization's direction and potentially hindering its progress.
It's like those in-group and out-group dynamics can create hidden currents that either propel the organization forward or hold it back.
And that's why leadership is so crucial. Leaders with their awareness of these currents have the ability to steer the organization in a more inclusive and equitable direction, counteracting those negative undercurrents.
This is really powerful stuff. We've covered so much ground, from the river metaphor to visible and invisible currents, and how this theory can be applied to so many different aspects of organizational life.
And we've seen how it connects with other well-known theories, adding a new layer of understanding to how culture works. But before we wrap things up, there's one more key element of Ruffin's theory that I think really brings it all together.
I'm all ears. What is it?
It's the tagline associated with this theory, because you can't drift your way to impact.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
It's so concise, but so powerful. It really speaks to the idea of being intentional, of recognizing that culture is not something static, but a force you have to actively engage with.
Exactly. And that tagline highlights something crucial about Ruffin's work. It's not just about understanding culture, it's about empowering leaders to shape it, to steer it towards positive change. And that's where things get really exciting. Because if culture is a river and leaders are the ones holding the oars,
Then we all have a role to play in navigating that river and creating the kind of organizational culture we want to be a part of. But how does someone who's not in a leadership role apply this theory to their own work experience?
that's a fantastic question. You see, one of the most empowering aspects of Ruffin's theory of cultural current is that it reminds us that even if you're not a leader in a formal sense, you're not powerless. You're not just along for the ride. You can choose how you navigate this river.
So even if you're not the CEO paddling the big raft, you're still piloting your own little kayak, so to speak, within that larger current.
Exactly. And understanding those currents, both the visible ones and the undercurrents, can help you make more informed choices about how you show up at work, how you interact with colleagues, and even how you advocate for the changes you want to see.
It's like that saying, be the change you want to see in the world, but applied to the workplace.
I like that. And it all starts with awareness. What are some of those undercurrents you're noticing in your own work environment? Are there unspoken power dynamics that are influencing decisions? Are certain voices being marginalized?
And here's a key question for our listeners to consider. Are those undercurrents aligned with the company's stated values? Or is there a disconnect between what the company says it stands for and how things actually work on the ground?
Because if there is a disconnect, that's where things can get really tricky. You might start to feel disillusioned or even like you're constantly paddling upstream.
You might start to see those DEI initiatives as just for show, or those fancy mission statements as empty words.
Exactly. But here's where Ruffin's theory offers some hope. Once you understand the currents, you can start to navigate them more strategically. You can find ways to align your actions with the kind of culture you want to see.
Maybe that means speaking up in meetings when you see an opportunity to challenge an outdated norm. Or maybe it's about mentoring a colleague who's facing those invisible barriers.
Or maybe it's simply about refusing to participate in gossip or negativity that reinforces those toxic undercurrents.
Because even small actions can create ripples, right? And those ripples can eventually help shift the direction of the entire river.
That's the power of individual agency within a larger system. And it's something that often gets overlooked in conversations about organizational culture.
And remember that tagline we discussed earlier, because you can't drift your way to impact. It's a powerful reminder that creating positive change requires intentionality, even if you're not the one at the helm.
You can't just sit back and hope that the current will magically take you to a better place. You have to be willing to paddle, to put in the effort, even when it's challenging.
And that's what I love about this deep dive. We've gone beyond just explaining a theory. We've explored how it can empower each of us, no matter our role, to become more conscious and intentional participants in shaping the cultures we work in.
Because ultimately, organizational culture isn't just something that happens to us, it's something we create together through our everyday choices and actions.
So to our listeners, we challenge you. Start paying attention to the currents in your own workplace. What are the visible currents? What are the undercurrents? And what role do you want to play in shaping the direction of the river?
Because with awareness comes the power to create positive change.
And that's a wrap on our deep dive into Ruffin's theory of cultural current. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.